let me start off by saying that collaborating to solve these water quality issues is more difficult than doing it alone. I mean, you just have more people to coordinate with, and it's also not something that's required. So why should we be thinking of it this way? And so the first prompt is, what does collaborative watershed management on Cape Cod mean to you? And why is it a valuable way to plan?
All right, well, am I on? All right. Well, first, thank you very much for having us here today. I'm happy to be here to talk about some of the collaborations across the region. And I think to start, maybe taking the second part of your question first, is that the watershed boundaries really define the problem. I think we have 15 towns across the region, but we have 53 watersheds. Some of those watersheds are located wholly within a single town, but 2/3 of them cross town boundaries. And so in most of our communities and most of our watersheds, no single community can really address the problem on their own. One community may work to address the entirety of their wastewater load in a particular watershed, but without the collaboration or the efforts by their neighboring community, we won't see the outcomes that I think we're all working toward and that we all want to see in our water bodies. So, in and of itself, collaborating across town boundaries in our watersheds and focusing on that jurisdiction of the problem lends itself to, the likelihood of more positive outcomes from a water quality perspective. I think we also found through development of the 208 plan, which many of you participated in, 10 or more years ago now at this point for its development, and that provides the framework for collaborating across town boundaries to address water quality issues. We found through that process that collaboration and shared infrastructure in appropriate areas potentially has some cost benefits and savings for communities. And so that those more cost-effective solutions also lend themselves to more positive outcomes potentially for our communities. I think so in and of itself, looking at the watershed boundaries is really important when we're thinking about this issue. I think, collaborative watershed management to me doesn't necessarily have to be an all or nothing approach. I think we have, and we're going to talk about, the Pleasant Bay Alliance and the 4 communities within the Pleasant Bay watershed today. That's a really great example of kind of more holistic watershed-based management and implementation of strategies to address the water quality issues in Pleasant Bay. That's also a really unique circumstance. They have existing plans in the 4 communities. They have an institutional structure that was kind of already present and helped to kind of continue the momentum within that shared watershed and make sure that those collaborations continued. That may not be possible in all watersheds. It may not be where all communities are at, but identifying where there's potential for collaboration, maybe it's a more targeted collaboration around, for example, extending sewer service area to a neighboring community. Those are also really important. So I think there's benefits to any type of approach when it comes to collaboration.
So from my perspective, what collaboration means depends on when you're talking about it. I think in the early stages, going back to the 208 plan, collaborative aspect of it was to find some common ground, common principles around which the Cape could coalesce to develop a strategy to deal with this problem. Everybody kind of sort of knew there was a problem. There was disagreement over the role of wastewater and septic systems as the driver of that. You had individual communities, all had somewhat different approaches, different bases for their analysis, and quite frankly, a lot of people who were heavily invested in kicking the can down the road and use a variety of tactics and techniques and strategies to delay the day of reckoning financially because for whatever reason they were short timers. They were able to sort of look past the problem and didn't want to have their towns do it. So early on, the notion around collaboration was to create some rational boundaries around which we could have these conversations, both in terms of the technologies, the approaches, what's a common understanding of the nature of the problem, and then the range of solutions that were reasonable to discuss as a way to, frankly, isolate and marginalize the fringe players who are either putting things out there that were not realistic and not going to be responsive to the scope and scale of the problem, or were just obstructionary and sounded sounded good, but were not positive contributors towards a solution. Once you sort of got past that hurdle, and I think by and large, we've gotten past a lot of that. Collaboration then means, I think, opportunities to do different things. Essential in the core of the 208 plan and why I think it's a fundamentally successful strategy for the Cape to move forward and has allowed a lot to move forward is that it provided a context where you could make a credible case that the cost of compliance could go from extraordinarily expensive to just expensive in a way that allowed you to chip away at that expense and come up with solutions that allowed you to move forward. So the whole idea of looking across town boundaries, and if you go back to when we started this conversation, there was a lot of concern that the outcome of 208 was going to be one centralized entity that solved the problems. And there was a lot of interest in town control. And I think the watershed approach and the collaboration that's underlying that was a recognition of what people wanted locally, but also was intended to help avoid towns continuing this go-it-alone mentality. And a lot of the cost savings comes from the fact that towns are working together and there are less expensive ways to solve the problem when you're not bound by the town boundary as your management unit. I think the collaboration that comes from that allows for those discussions to happen. And I think, we could talk a little bit more about it. I think we're in a stage now where collaboration allows for town-based but watershed-focused solutions to move forward where they might not have otherwise occurred.
That was great.
Takes a second. Okay. That was great. Thank you too. It sounds
like a great way forward for sure. And I love that there's that flexibility
aspect to it. Like you said, it's not all or nothing. It can be different levels of collaboration. The next prompt is looking to hear more about if towns and communities are looking to collaborate, what does that look like? Could you please pull from past examples of successful collaborations to protect water? I know you've mentioned the 208 plan already, but are there
other examples you could provide for us?
Sure. So there are some formal examples. People talk about the Pleasant Bay Agreement. There's agreements between Mashpee Sandwich and Barnstable. There's collaboration and agreement between specific around the sewers to Chatham and Harwich, where there are examples. I think the Outer Cape one's probably a little bit more concrete in terms of delivering some results. But these other discussions around intermunicipal agreements have laid a framework, like the Mashpee Sandwich Barnstable agreement hasn't resulted in anything much changing on the ground, to be honest, but it creates a framework in which the towns have the ability to and acknowledge the potential benefit of, for example, Sandwich perhaps doing less in its watershed, but paying Mashpee to do more nitrogen control within the bounds of the town of Mashpee because it's cheaper for Mashpee to do it, and Sandwich can make a contribution. Let's say, if it would cost Sandwich $1 for a pound of nitrogen reduction, they can pay Mashpee 75 cents. It costs Mashpee 50 cents. So Mashpee makes a quarter, Sandwich saves a quarter every pound reduced. That agreement provides a framework for that conversation to happen. It hasn't happened and it hasn't become mature yet, but I think there are examples within all of these intermunicipal agreements, and they're becoming more sophisticated as each one builds on the next, and people recognize what has happened or what hasn't happened as a result of the way the agreements are structured. That it creates the basis to move forward and to actually have logical projects implemented about where they're most cost effective. And in the end, that's really what the 208 was ultimately about.
I also think there's a lot of examples of regional collaboration where it's not necessarily directed around a particular water body, but where all 15 towns have come together to support really key priorities and advancing projects. And that dates back, I think, to the Water Protection Collaborative, who really made sure that funds came to the region and followed the process and engaged in the 208 process to ensure that recommendations were what the region needed. But then more recently, I think in the time that I've been working on this issue, the most successful collaboration has been around funding. So funding was identified in the 208 plan as one of the most critical challenges to implementing wastewater infrastructure, whether it's through shared watershed management or whether it's a town-wide comprehensive wastewater management plan. The funding piece was critical and was a reason why a lot of the plans weren't moving toward implementation and why they weren't gaining the public support necessary for implementation. And so, over the last several years, all 15 communities have worked to ensure that the Water Protection Fund, the Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund, is a sustainable source of funding for all 15 towns. And so, from the 208 plan, which recommended the creation of this new fund, the Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund was created in 2019. All 15 Cape towns are members of that fund, and any community that advances a project through the state's revolving fund loan program is provided with a subsidy for that project. We have seen, I think, incredible success to that program, so much so that project demand outpaced anything we had ever anticipated in the projections. But over the last 5 years, that fund has been able to commit over $200 million in subsidies to Cape and Islands projects, and the 15 towns have worked together. The members of that management board have worked together to ensure that that fund can remain sustainable well into the future. It has a dedicated source of revenue in the short-term rental tax, a 2.75% tax on short-term rentals, and project costs have been increasing over the last 4 to 5 years, in part due to increased costs, as we're all seeing, but in part because we are seeing so many projects. We had the state revolving fund loan process. Prior to the creation of the fund, we had, I'll say in the 3 years prior to creation of the fund, there was just one project from Cape community, a Cape community listed on the state's intended use plan for state revolving funds. And in the years since creation of that fund, 12 of the 15 towns have advanced projects through that process. So it has provided that critical piece, I think, that communities have needed to ensure that those projects can be implemented, and that's the result of all 15 towns coming together on that particular issue. And I think that is another example of real collaboration.
I mean, I think if anything, what Erin just said sort of undersells the importance of the collaborative nature of that. Every town, or a bunch of towns prior to the creation of the fund, were arguing for additional assistance from somewhere, right? It was too much for the property tax base to bear, and every town and every town official, you can all make a really good impassioned case on why your project's really important and needs to move to the top of the list. And generically, those arguments politically essentially went nowhere. It was only wasn't until towns all sort of coalesced around a single strategy and took advantage of an opportunity. And the opportunity presented itself very quickly, which is often the case in these situations. By the time you recognize a political opportunity that you can take advantage of for something large, like what we were talking about, if you haven't developed the relationships and developed some consensus on where you want to go, by the time the opportunity presents itself and you don't have preparation done, you have lost the opportunity. So it's a really good case study. In fact, I'm not aware of a better case study of a public policy issue of this size, significance, and complexity than the creation of the Cape and Islands Water Protection Trust Fund, in terms of people sort of coming together, wrestling through some really hard and contentious issues, and not everybody got everything they wanted out of it. But that's what collaboration, consensus, our consensus builder over here, Tana Marie, is nodding her head aggressively. That's what consensus building is actually about. And collectively, the towns speaking with one voice, even though there was nuance and disagreement among all the towns about exactly how it was going to play out, was the thing that allowed us to speak with a single voice and create the political conditions necessary to get something that any rational person looking at the situation would have said, you guys are crazy, you have no shot at getting that done. And yet, $200 million, and for those of you at the municipal level, every penny that comes from the Cape and Islands Trust is dollar for dollar property tax relief. And so in terms of talking back to your constituents and the people that, are concerned about this issue, nobody anywhere in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts has a better story to tell about providing relief on the property tax base than the collective communities of Cape Cod do in the context of wastewater.
Maybe one more, just kind of regional collaboration too, where I think there's opportunity for more to be done. The region has collaborated with the state over many years to support monitoring too. I think it's really important that we're making all these investments in water quality infrastructure. We also need to monitor our water bodies and ensure that they're having the expected outcomes and impact. And so, the county and the state have funded a regional water quality monitoring program for many years. In the last year, the Cape and Islands Water Protection Fund, who is allowed through their legislation to fund monitoring in our coastal water bodies, has also dedicated resources to that effort. So they funded this last year of monitoring. They just recently voted to fund the next year of monitoring. And that funds the monitoring at the Sentinel stations in each water body, as well as some other areas along the coast of the Cape and Islands. I think moving forward, knowing that there are likely going to be additional monitoring requirements associated with watershed permit compliance, there's the potential to do more around monitoring. Many communities are doing that on their own. In some areas, we're not doing more monitoring kind of comprehensively in a water body, but it will be something that we have to think about expanding moving forward.
Thank you very much. I have a follow-up question. I'm wondering if the Water Protection Fund,
did that also eliminate or reduce the competition between towns?
for funding, or just collaboration and collaborating
Together, is that also a mechanism to sort of reduce competing against one another to get their projects funded?
Maybe in part. I think every project through the Water Protection Fund is treated the same. So all towns go in with the same expectation that if they are if they're financing their project through the state revolving fund, they are going to get the same level, same percent subsidy, I should say, as their neighboring communities. So from a competition perspective, I think that's a little, that's helpful. But I don't think that eliminates competition for other resources.
Yeah, I think that the main path, the sole pathway to get funding from the Cape and Islands Trust is to qualify for a state revolving loan fund project. So it's less a competition among Cape towns than it is a competition among all 351 eligible communities who have wastewater projects moving forward. Department of Environmental Protection, you'll hear from later, has been a really solid long-term partner with the Cape in helping to build this infrastructure around prioritization of wastewater projects. And that was solidified recently in some changes that were done to the scoring priority system that put the Cape projects, frankly, we start with an advantage. And it's a really solid advantage because our projects, by definition, nutrient management projects, are in the top tier of projects. Now, there's a lot of other top tier projects to compete against as well that are big ticket items in other parts of the state. But the system is set up in a way that recognizes the importance of the work that's being done here. And there's a window of opportunity. You never know how long these things are going to last. But structurally, things are set up in a way that favor Cape communities moving forward. There is money in the system. There's money. The state has been a consistent player in contributing funding to wastewater management projects. The federal government, through the bipartisan infrastructure law, is in year 3 of a major 5-year infusion of capital that, because of the way Massachusetts manages its projects, is actually subject to doubling or tripling of the amount of money that can come to towns. The window of opportunity right now, as the rules of the game are structured, will never be better to advantage Cape communities moving forward than they are right now. So if you're thinking, well, we might wait 3 or 4 years, you're risking it. The next year or two are the times when there's a ton of money, and the Cape and Islands Trust Fund was modified in the way it accounts for and manages its money. There's plenty of money in the Cape and Islands Fund to provide assured 25% subsidy financing for the foreseeable future moving forward. So your window of opportunity to move with projects is never going to be better than now. And there are 15 towns on the Cape, 351 in Massachusetts, 336 towns would trade places with you in terms of the financial opportunities to spread costs away from your tax base for wastewater management projects. The Cape is cheaper to build. There's higher amounts of subsidy available to Cape towns than there are any other communities in Massachusetts.
Great, thank you. I feel like now we've built some momentum with that statement, and we can transition now to talk a little bit more about the challenges of collaborating. Could you each choose one or two top challenges towns or subregions face when collaboratively managing watersheds, and maybe highlight some potential paths to overcome these challenges?
So I can start. I think prioritizing which watersheds to address over which timeline is really difficult. 80% of our land area is located within a coastal embayment watershed. Most of our communities are dealing with many watersheds within their town boundaries, and potentially, coordinating or collaborating with multiple neighboring communities. And so I think that it's hard. It's hard to figure out kind of where to focus the attention. Not everything can be done at once. And your priorities may be different from your neighboring town's priorities. But I think it also presents an opportunity in that, certainly in coordination with DEP and pending DEP approval, there are opportunities to structure, I think, watershed permit plans that both address the challenges in that particular water body, but also allow you to think about what your priorities are as a community and where you need to focus your attention. For example, there may be a watershed that your neighboring community is focusing on in phase one, but you may be able to deprioritize and maybe focus your efforts in that watershed to a later phase because you have more pressing concerns in a watershed on the opposite side of town. And I think that is particularly important in addressing some of the other challenges that communities are facing. I feel like I would be remiss if I didn't talk about some of those other challenges because the Commission's role is balancing both economic progress and environmental protection. And while water quality is definitely the highest priority in terms of focusing wastewater infrastructure and water quality projects, we have to deal with the issues that we face today. We also have a massive housing crisis, and I've spent the better part of the last year working on a housing strategy for the region. There are opportunities where we need to focus our wastewater infrastructure in areas to support redevelopment in appropriate areas for housing. And wastewater plays a critical role there too. And I know communities are grappling with that. And so coordinating across town boundaries to phase appropriately within your watershed permit plans, I think is a huge challenge, but there are also huge opportunities to collaborate to make that work.
So I'm going to say a few things that you as a government employee can't in answering this question. I think the primary challenge, and I don't disagree with anything Erin said, is largely political. And by that, it's political and managerial. The political part of it is, while there's a general, if you look at town meeting votes across the Cape in the last 5 years, with very few exceptions, there's an almost unanimous embrace at town meetings to move forward with projects. The hurdles to getting voter approval, frankly, have never been lower. And the penalty, frankly, if you're a political person, has shifted. In the past, it was, I'm afraid for my political skin. If I bring a question of X tens of millions of dollars before my voters, I'm going to get killed for that. Now I think the dynamics change to the point where if I'm not putting these projects forward, I'm going to get killed for that, as you should. That said, and given that there is broad public consensus, the people in any given community that are driving the bus on solutions is still relatively small. And the natural order of things got in town halls, some reasons good and some reasons bad, there's turnover. And you can lose your champion and your knowledge base faster than you can imagine. Whether it's somebody who's in an elected position, somebody at the staff level who's driving the conversation, somebody at an appointed committee level who's driving the conversation, and not having depth there, and not having sort of a succession plan of energy and institutional knowledge and tactical approach puts your whole program at risk. So we've seen it in a number of different communities where somebody leaves for one reason or another, and the project and the program takes a step back because nobody's really sure what to do next or what the rules of the game are or any of that. So that political question, you can't have enough people in your elected positions who value and are committed to maintaining progress on water quality. And collectively, we all need to make sure that the people who are running are educated, conversant in these issues, and screened for their views. And if you don't like what you hear, get somebody else. And if you don't like somebody else, do it yourself. You need depth. You can't rely on one or two people because people's lives change. That's one. The other major challenge is managerial. And by that I mean there are enormous institutional, attitudinal impediments to taking on projects of these scale and sort and dealing with alternative financing structures in town halls. Your treasurers, your finance directors, the people that are dealing with these projects, some embrace it as an interesting challenge to move forward. Some are resistant as hell about it. And the resistance manifests itself in ways you're not going to likely see unless you're looking for it. And so, yeah, these are expensive, big-ticket projects. But when you start working through the financing options that are available, there's ways to whittle through them such that numerous towns have been able to move forward with really big-ticket items, whether you think that's a good idea or not. The reality is they have, and they've been able to do it without having significant impact on their tax rates. And that is not what you're inclined to hear on first reaction from your professional staff in the finance side. It's going to be, oh, we can't afford that. It's going to kill our tax rate. No, it's not. There are demonstrators. Go talk to Orleans. Go talk to Mashpee. Go talk to Yarmouth. There are numerous examples out there where people have taken really big bites of the apple at really affordable rates. And I would bet most of your financial staff don't get that, and they won't tell their town managers that in the first instance. So you really have to pay attention to that. It's a really stealthy, risky factor as we move forward with these projects that needs to be addressed.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for any last thoughts or anything you wanted to address.
I mean, I think we've talked about opportunities for additional collaboration moving forward. I also think we have a lot of good examples of success. And so there are models already locally. There's a lot of really great existing collaboration that can be modeled in other communities. So I think I would just, leave everybody with that we've made a lot of progress over the last 10 or so years. And there's a lot more work to be done. And I think there are both local collaborations as well as regional collaborations that can help really promote additional work, additional success.
And I think the model for dealing with our estuaries is pretty well set. When you look at the financing options, look at the regulatory changes DEP has made and are going to be talking about, the pathway is pretty clear. It takes some political will and some engineering thought and expertise and the ability to blend in some of the alternative approaches. But in many respects, it will take longer than I want it to take. The estuarine issues are well on their way to being resolved in one form or another. The bar needs to get raised because we have enormous challenges in our freshwater environment, and almost none of the municipal plans have incorporated enough thought, for good reason, because you weren't being pushed to do it. But freshwater is sort of the next big frontier that we're going to have to deal with. It's the flip side of the same coin. Some of the things are going to be the same, some of them are going to be different. But I would really encourage people to begin to think more aggressively while keeping the pressure on your communities to move forward on the marine environment. You need to think more expansively and thoughtfully about freshwater systems, and think about freshwater systems as resources and things that have intrinsic, ecological, aesthetic, and utility, value and utility that goes beyond just being a nitrogen sink for a marine system. They warrant our protection, and they're under a ton of stress and strain, no less so than the marine environment. It's time for us to turn our attention to that.